think Hegel fucks?
You mean like really fucks?
Yeah, like people.
I think he definitely fucks. Yes.
Right, because like reading this, it's like we all know fucking Kant's a like little
altar boy. Yeah.
Right. But like first few pages, and it's been a while since I picked up Hegel, but it's like, this guy fucks.
He's so arrogant. So like he's got so much big dick energy in this. He's
just like no. What we need is the absolute.
Yes,
you know, I'm gonna.
Philosophy is science, and then science, real science, that shit. We're the real science. You fucking assholes.
Yeah, I love that. That's his like epistemological claim too. He's like, now science is real and it's right, and philosophy's got to be science. But science sucks.
Yeah, I am going to get into that part about how stupid he is. There,
lifeless numbers.
Yeah, lifeless numbers. Like he talks about history and then he talks about mathematics right next to each other, and there's like no synthesis. He's like, he does not think about like the process of science at all. So, but it was early. I just feel like he had this like he was like in the middle of this moment where mathematics is like, look what we're doing, guys. You guys are talking nonsense, and he's like, hell no, I'm about to talk some nonsense.
Yeah, you ain't seen nonsense yet.
Well, he has that bit where he's like, people are talking about like how unreadable it is, but that you know that's the function of the philosophical proposition.
All they have to do is read Kant first, and then Hegel's the most readable shit you've ever read. Yeah. Also, we're talking about the book.
Oh wait,
the Bible.
Have we started?
Have we started? I don't know.
Oh yeah. Hey guys, this is Text of the Matter, and
I'm Egon. Hi.
And I'm Misha, and we are diddling with the negative.
We're diddling with the negative, and we're talking about phenomenology of spirit. Phenomenology of Geist.
Yeah.
Geist.
Yeah.
If you were German.
Phenomenology of the absolute. Phenomenology of the subject.
But this is the meme book, so this is the one we're using. So, translated by A.V. Miller. But yeah, no, I don't ever get that. I find Hegel to actually be quite readable. I mean, for philosophy.
It depends the chapter.
That's true.
I mean, when he gets into that, this has become self-conscious of that, and it becomes for itself, and that.
Well, it becomes Plato, itself, where it's like for itself, know.
I mean, that can get where you're like, you need an editor. But at times, he's extremely lucid. Obviously, what we're going to talk about, the prologue, is very lucid. If you've read Kant. So I guess we should begin, since that's where we left off, was with Kant. And I kind of want to talk about like this moment in Kant, right? That's located by a couple philosophers. So, Zizek defines it very certainly.
I can answer you this one perfectly.
Which is that like the empty form of the I, right? Like the
butthole
the empty form of the subject, the fact that there is both the empirical subject and there is the formal dimensions of the subject to be filled by the various faculties, right? That is the beginning of doubling and the beginning of negativity. And it's the point at which Deleuze locates a lot of important values. It's a point at which actually Adorno locates it elsewhere, but he also locates this doubling effect. We now have both the empirical positing of the thing, and then we have its like abstraction. Right?
It is the moment in which science and philosophy, basically come together to say, well, our existence, our world is mediated.
Yeah.
And so through the mediation of our senses, whether that's our eyes, our ears, our senses, taking in the manifold of experience, but it's all mediated through our brain, through our cognition. And this is what Adorno, at least in his lectures on Kant, likes to call the doubling or the mirroring of the world, in that we are never experiencing the world directly, but we're always experiencing the world mediated. And so in that way it is doubled or mirrored, as he says. Right.
But what's fascinating about Kant is that he didn't recognize it, right?
Right.
And he goes on to say that, speculative philosophy, this point at which philosophy is purely within the realm of the conceptual, is problematic. That's one of his problematic dialectics that he goes through, and including freedom and God. Like these are elements that he could not put within the realm of understanding. And so that's kind of where we need to situate Hegel, right?
Yeah, and Hegel, so with this episode, what we're really looking at is the prologue to this book, which is helpful because it really encapsulates, or at least he tries to set out and encapsulate everything else he's going to talk out in the rest of the book. But it's really handy because, like, if you're in an intro to philosophy course or something, they're going to make you read the prologue to this book.
Yes.
And so a lot of people come across it. Also, it's lively enough where it's easy to talk about. But in the prologue, Hegel jumps right in, and he wants to talk about the absolute. He wants to talk about freedom.
Yeah.
He wants to talk about immortality.
Yeah.
And he uses various words for these. But basically, where Kant leaves us with what is metaphysics, Kant would conclude can't do,
Yes.
Or can't talk about, but really is the realm of metaphysics, which is these universal abstract concepts that underpins pretty much all of philosophical discourse.
And so there's one more reference we need to make to Kant, which is Kant had this cleavage, this division, right, of the phenomenal and the nominal, right? He had this idea of that which appears for us and that which is within human knowledge, and knowledge, the subject, conforms to this external force of knowledge in a sense, right? But then once it is within thought, it conforms to us, and there's this externality that we cannot know. Where the cleavage actually happens is Hegel. Hegel cuts it off. It is all part of a single process, right?
Yes.
And he's really doing something very interesting here, because he's changing the meaning of substance, right? Like, we can go back to the rationalists, and when the rationalists talk about substance, they're talking about it in a naive sense, right? Or even going back to Plato or going to Aristotle, where Aristotle's saying substance combined with form is matter, right?
Right.
Well, substance was something that you could reach out and grab, was substantial, right? Particularly when you talk about Leibniz, the monad, little atoms of substance.
Yeah. It's more in that common sense way that we would refer to something having, or not like a person having substance, but right, like, what substance is this made of?
Yes.
Right? Like,
and what Hegel does is he posits that substance is this bare immediacy, right? That we kind of begin at face value with substance as like sense perception, as this general sense perception that is coalescing all of subjects, right?
Well, and I think that's the really fundamental important part, because when Hegel talks about substance, he, even very quickly on early in the book, equates it immediately to subject. And so sort of more in that way you would use it conversationally, like, if someone has substance or not. It's sort of more in that realm, but certainly way beyond that, because he's equating substance to subjectivity, to selfhood almost, in a way that something substance is what makes it.
Yes.
And in this way is trying to pry open sort of the cleavage you're mentioning, the work that Kant did, because Kant is like, okay, he develops this concept of a phenomenal world, the world that we experience, the world that we deal with directly in our sort of empirical lives, and and then has a noumenal side that he says that's things in themselves. We can't know anything about the noumenal world, and Hegel comes right out and is like, no, no,
exactly.
This is what philosophy's job is,
Yes.
and the only way to do, when he takes it beyond, like you were saying, philosophy, the only way, in fact, to do science is to talk about the noumenal, is to talk about the absolute.
Yeah, the nominal, it ceases to be the nominal.
Yeah.
It becomes the self-positing of substance as the negative, right? So if substance is subject, right, then what is the self-consciousness of subject? It is an abstraction, but it is still contained within substance, right? It is the becoming of substance, as he describes it. And so suddenly what was this kind of hazy doubling in Kant becomes a determinate process, right, of what he calls bare negativity or simple negativity in relation to bare sense perception. That is the self-positing of the subject against itself, seeing itself as an object, right? And so there's just like a big transformation where now nothing is outside of philosophy. So we can rewind a little bit, which to the point where we're talking about science, because when he says science, he doesn't mean science as we regard it today, because there was obviously
he was writing this in the early 1800s,
yeah.
So things were a bit different.
Yes, and there was a conflict, right? There was a conflict about truth value, and many people, you had a range of things from extremely ecstatic kind of mystic arguments about philosophy, and I'm sure in here he's taking some slights at Fichte and Schelling when he talks about nature or talks about pure sex.
Yeah, he does. He doesn't mention a lot of philosophers in the prologue, but he does whip out the diss track for Fichte. He's like, no.
And he also talks about kind of like the empiricists and their bare facts, right? But instead, when he talks about science, he's talking about something that captures the pure dynamics, the conceptualization and the living of life, right? And the process of its pure negation, death, which cannot fully determine substance, but partially determines it, but it still continues on in the form of spirit. So you have these kind of three figures, right? Substance as like this bare form of like simple, in its simple state. The subject as both the human subject and the subject of the proposition in a sentence, right? And then the subject's process of becoming an I, and then the goal of creating a science of this all, a philosophical science, which is absolute, as he says, right?
Right.
So it's definitely a strange curve from Kant, but it includes all of Kant in it, and then some, and then some revision.
Well, and I think too, to speak to science at that time, and this isn't like a solid fact, but definitely there's and I meant to look it up before we started this, but there's a book that just came out about Hegel and mysticism, but part of the sort of scientific tradition of this time did include these sort of hand-me-downs from the alchemists of earlier time.
Yeah.
And it's coming out in a lot of different books that, everyone from Newton to, a lot of the different scientists of the time were not only interested in figuring out laws of physics, but were very interested in, creating DMT and having these experiences. And, I can't say for certain what Hegel's relationship was to psychedelic substances or anything, but he is coming from this tradition of, we're going to break things wide open and we're going to discover what the ultimate truth is. Yeah. And, I think for Hegel, Kant's sort of, very conservative epistemology is not cutting the cheese for him. He wants to create a rift and find the ultimate source of truth. Yeah. And so I think a great place to start, and I know we've been rambling for quite some time with this, but I think Hegel rolls right out with this book, and he's got capital A absolute, he's got capital N notion, he's got, maybe even capital N negative, and I think we really need to talk for a second particularly about negative, but what is he talking about when he's talking about absolute, when he's talking about notion, and when he's talking about negative? Because essentially Hegel's coming out and he's saying that the only way that we can do proper philosophy, that we can do proper science, is by taking things as they are, as their substance, like capital S substance. So in doing so, he wants to find what he calls the notion.
Yes.
Right?
Well, I think there's a great figure that he puts in here that we can easily quote to just get an idea of the absolute, right? And the idea of the process that he's doing, which is that he says to take the absolute as it is just uttered, right? Because this is an important figure throughout the prologue. To take the absolute as it is uttered compared to as it is fully formed is to take saying there are all animals and take that for zoology, right?
Right.
So like the absolute is determinately concerned with culture, right? It's concerned with God. It's concerned with everything that composes a human society.
Yeah, and that's important because concerned with God, but God is not to be found. I mean, maybe he mentions God's name
mentions
once,
him a couple times, but he says you can't posit it as God because God is predicated, right?
Right.
But we'll get there later.
Yeah.
But he's trying to talk about what society, the human society, in all of its historical valences, at all the levels of knowledge that it's accrued over time. How does one as an individual and how does a group of people as a society build their knowledge towards this point of absolute, which includes self-knowing, right? And so that's where the capital S subject comes into it, because the basic function of substance is it functions in two ways, both as a universal subject and as a particular subject. So we can say that as the individual or subjectivity in general. And how they function is that they posit themselves. Substance posits itself. It's self-moving, as he describes it, right? And that self-moving creates what he calls simple negativity, right? Or becoming. And so the process is that the subject is there as like a subject of a sentence, right? And in their relationship to being predicated, to be given meaning, they have to posit that meaning as as the subject I, and think about it. And in that thinking, they create an abstraction. That abstraction is a form of negativity. So simultaneously, you have this positive whole that is the movement towards the absolute, that is the spirit in that movement. And then you have the negative becoming that is imminent to its process, that has to be, paralleled or contradicted in meaning for the original subject to have any meaning, and for this subject to transform and develop in knowledge.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most confusing parts of this bit of Hegel, right? Because he's always diddling with the negative. Anyway, but what does he say? What's Zizek's book called?
Tearing.
Thank you. I forgot
Yeah, and
what the actual phrase was.
he says it multiple times.
He says it in the prologue, and I think at first blush it's sort of a confusing conception, because he's equating this negative quality to becoming, which seems very contradictory. It seems, well, isn't that a positive thing? But sort of as you were saying, what he's actually talking about and what he's actually trying to work through is the process of becoming. And especially if you think about it in like grammar form, like there's a subject that you are describing, that you're making a judgment about. And in making that judgment, there's actually a negative act happening, because you're taking something that was static and defined, the subject, and you're altering it. And that's what he, when he's going on and on about a negative, he's going on about this capacity for difference, basically, and so you just sort of start seeing the early flashes of the dialectic here, because what he's talking about is this circle, in a way that you start with subjecthood, it becomes changed, but is still itself.
Yes.
That it still maintains its capital S substance. That and so, by describing something, you are while it seems additive, you are negating an original premise and making a new one that is still equaling the same thing.
Yes,
in a way.
And we can think about it in multiple ways, right? Like, you can very easily think of it as, okay, there is knowledge and people have knowledge. And he goes through this quite clearly, right? Yeah. There are stages of knowledge. There's old knowledge that was once something that philosophers thought about, that become games for children, as he says, right? So there are things that we know about, I don't know, you could pick any subject, like the construction of a table, right? Where at some point that was something that someone had to think out, right? And so those things, they are sustained within the spirit, right? They're sustained within the universal subject. But as time goes on, people very quickly go through those stages, right? They're able to go through them faster. And so each particular subject is on independently going through this process. But as each subject is doing it, they are in total making a spiritual movement, right? He even talks about particular spirit, right? And so the notion is that there's the confrontation between the subject as they are thinking and the subject as they are actually, right? Which is interesting because many would think of actuality as an externality, right? External to that subjectivity. But it's instead the difference between when you are positing a thought for yourself as thought, right? And you're thinking about it abstractly, and when it becomes naturalized, when it becomes part of your substance and you just live it, right? And then there's something else that comes into conflict, and then you have to go over that. So he's making a very powerful argument that there is an actual series that leads to the absolute, but the practical side that you can take from it, that we are constantly in this process of thinking and concretizing or actualizing, thinking and actualizing, and that this is a process of simple becoming of the subject as a whole that forms into a society, right? That's actually a great leap over Kant, which, we can get into his morality another time, but he has a very different idea of how society is built, and it's not so intrinsic to the human.
Right. I mean, because Hegel's really trying to find this break in this idea of causality in so many ways, and he's really trying to make us find this break in what he calls moments of time, right? Yes. And so to bring it back to a logical argument that someone like Kant would make or something, it's like I can bring a subject and then add a predicate to that subject, say, you're old, or I am old. But Hegel cringes at this because he's very much interested in what is the substance of you, or what is the substance of I, right? So I could say Betty White is old, but Betty White is old now, but Betty White is also young. Betty White lived as was a young child, was a baby, was a teenager, was a young 20-something-year-old person. And so when we make these kinds of judgments, they're actually false judgments. We are describing a moment in time, but we are not describing that subject.
Do you think Hegel fucks?
That subject isn't old, and these concepts, of course, can become reified, where we can say for time immemorial, Betty White is old because that was her fame for a certain group of people, and that's how she's remembered. But in a substantial sense, making any judgment about her age is inherently false, because it's only true for a very short partial time, right? And and so Hegel's really, he's trying to break through. I always look at it as the constraints of logic, because logicians, I think, sometimes tend to paint themselves in a corner that way, and he is no, there is progress here, but that progress, while it does change the subject, does not change the substance of that subject.
Yes.
Right.
Very true. Very true. Now, and it plays out in his disregard for the fixity of ideas.
Right.
Inevitably, he sees a major problem to thinking is the idea that we reach an idea, a notion, right, ready-made, that we come to it Hegel's book is great, right? And then we just take that as it is. He puts it in terms of mathematical theorems and various examples, but he wants ideas to be active, right? And in an active process. And he sees this as a determinate process of the negative, right? In determining the subject. And that's another concept that we need to think about, which is determination, right? Like the subject becomes self-conscious of themselves, right? Objectifies themselves. And then that objectification has to be returned to the substance itself. And in that process are a series of determinations about the thing, about the concept, and the concept's relationship to itself. Another thing that I was thinking about in relation to what you were saying was one difference that he makes, which will determine the way that other people see Hegel's dialectic, is that he differentiates like mere predication, right? Like you could say anything is a predicate, right, of something else, or many things. But that there are very essential forms of conceptual predication that have great meaning, and therefore we must understand these essences to reach this final part of the absolute. So that's another thing that he adds to this relationship of the subject and the predicate, right, in a logical, grammatical sense that kind of defines what he's talking about, where being comes in, where the one time he mentions God comes in. Right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So he, in the prologue, he gives us the proposition God is being. Yeah. And he goes to critique this sentence because it kind of made me chuckle because he rolls in like a fucking bull in a china shop with all his capital A absolute, these proper nouns, but he recognizes in this proposition that the word God, capital G, God, is just a name. Mm-hmm. And the subject of that sentence, if you break it down grammatically, the subject would be God, and the predicate is being. Yes. But he locates it as, well, no, being is the subject, yes, and we are just naming it, yes, right? And so you start to get the like twinklings of what is the dialectic, essentially, where he's finding, and I don't want to use the word opposite. He, of course, uses the word antithesis, but, he is finding what is the substance, again, of something. And oftentimes those things include things that, in this case, he's dealing away with mere description.
Yes.
But in some cases that the predicate and the subject are mediated to form a new subject, that the subject is altered. And I think that's his big thing because, in his search for the absolute, and you won't find anywhere, at least in the prologue, where he goes out and says, this is what the absolute is,
He actually tacitly begins by saying, I'm not going to lay out principles for you, because that's essentially a lie, right? To lay out these principles of what things are going to be, to give this immediate sense perception of what is, without actually demonstrating the process of the production of these ideas and their aspect in a science.
Right.
Well,
and by naming them, he's negating his whole quote-unquote science, right? Yes. It's like, well, we are through this process of mediation of taking subject, finding its notion, and thus finding a new and changed subject that's still the old and same subject that will lead us to the absolute. By naming it right away, you've already destroyed your whole process, right? And that's his problem with the God example. It's like, you can't name God. You can't start with the name of the thing you haven't found yet. Exactly. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, right?
And I think we can now introduce two more terms that are necessary. Or we'll start with one. Reason, right? So there has to be a movement, a force behind all of this. What is it that's driving this process, right? And reason is what allows us to come into self-consciousness. It is what allows us to isolate ourselves as the object, as the kind of mover and shaker of substance.
And this, as he said, is like sort of the next step beyond animal feeling, if I remember correctly. He just describes it that way.
Well, he has various different ways of describing this kind of bare simplicity that we begin with, right? And animality is one part of it. Just bare sense perception is another. But it becomes a reasonable process. And we have to think about this in relation to Kant. For Kant, reason was one of three things, right? There was the understanding, there was reason, and then there was the imagination, right? And these are schematized and ordered. And reason only has power over itself when we're talking about practical things, right? Well, here, reason suddenly becomes a motivating force for the understanding and for itself as the means by which we become self-conscious of ourselves and therefore mediate ourselves and therefore mediate substance, right? By abstracting that substance. So that it isn't just bare immediacy.
Right.
So, he's doing many things to like transform what Kant made as like a complex architecture into a fluid process, a fluid system, right? There is a formalism. He describes as the triadic structure. That is the dialectic. But that formalism
and he locates that triadic structure in Kant, in his working through of the binaries and the antinomies. But like, as you're saying, is taking this, because I think, Hegel's biggest enemy is fixity, right? And what he's really, and I don't think he uses this word dynamic, but what he's really trying to shoot for, what he's really trying to communicate, is the fact that the world and the forces in it and the subjects in it, we're all living in a dynamic life. And through that dynamism, nothing is static. So, trying to make judgments or syllogisms about things becomes inherently problematic, because as soon as you've done that, whatever you started with has changed.
Yes.
And will never go back.
And you have changed it.
Yes, and you have changed it. And this is, if you're trying to like connect dots from Hegel to Kant, this is what Deleuze would call where Kant finds freedom.
Yes.
Is in the fact that in trying to figure out how we can make judgments and say that something is an effect of a certain cause, and how do you trace that causal chain all the way back, is to locate in humans that we have a spontaneity.
Yes.
And in our spontaneity can disrupt the chain, the cause and effect chain. And that's essentially what Hegel is grasping onto, is that we are these spontaneous creatures, always becoming, always becoming. We are being.
And so we can make a distinction there, and that was a fascinating point about Deleuze. So what is it, when they both talk about becoming, why is it that they are distinguished? Why are they put on opposite sides? And that is because part of becoming for Hegel, right, is two things. One, it is the search for the true.
Yes.
Right? So ultimately, what is true is realized spirit. What is true is the subject become self-conscious of themselves, and having taken that self-consciousness in fully, and then understanding itself so that it can return to that like state of simplicity. What is the absolute? It is true, the true form of culture. So there's that. But there also is the fact that in this negative process of becoming always returns back to the identity of the subject. So that's the second word, the truth and identity, right? And so for Hegel, that's one of the reasons why essences like being become so important, because these are major concepts to which society is thinking of itself, right? At the same time, they are not static. But what he's positing fundamentally is that what society is an extension of, and what things happening is the subject thinking through and acting out in a process together, right? And that forms a spiritual whole that can be realized in the absolute and will realize the absolute if it comes to full self-consciousness of its process, of its ideas.
Yeah, it's in many ways it's a grand act of manifestation.
Yes.
You know, and it's always an ongoing process. You know, is the other thing, and that's why he gets really upset and he uses like dead propositions when he's describing his problem with his critique of sciences, and that the way that he sees what science is trying to do is this isolation of concepts, right? And so he uses the example of a right-angled triangle and like Pythagorean's theorem.
To me, one of the worst moments in it, but I would.
It's obtuse for sure to keep it with the triangle metaphor, but he's making this claim that we can't be completing, right, this grand gesture, this grand arc towards the absolute without following the notion, without following the substance. And what he finds that science is obsessed with is these isolation, and obviously this is how the scientific method works, is you isolate all your variables and look at one thing, but you start losing sense of the whole in that aspect.
Okay, so let's talk about this scientific critique, because I think it ultimately bears on one of the contemporary philosophical problems, one that I'm dealing with myself right now, which is this critique of correlationism. And on the one hand, I absolutely agree with this critique, and on the other hand, I absolutely don't. So there are two aspects of it. The first aspect is talking about the scientific process itself, right? Which is that it is, at least at his time, that it was going around saying, look at what we have proved and shown as theorems. How amazing are we, right? And then someone else could just go and copy the answers of that or remember the formulas and be called a mathematician. And he says, no, that's not a mathematician. Right. A mathematician actually has to understand how the theorem works, right? And I think that is true because, like, even now, scientific thought is based upon, or the theory of science that we're all taught is based on what Popper would call deductive falsification, right? Hume pretty much proved that you can't induce knowledge, right? Kant tried to fight against that, but science didn't accept Kant's solution, right? So Popper said, oh no, we're not inductively finding this knowledge. We are deductively falsifying our experiments, and they're in constant flow. But later you would have people like Feyerabend or Thomas Kuhn, who's more famous for his paradigm concept, right? Who said that these things actually happen counterinductively, where science happens in small ways and big ways, and that people will pick up small failed ideas and they will return.
Well, this is actually embraces the accidental of it all, too. So like whether that's penicillin or LSD, it's like not really what they were trying to do, And
that coincides very much with Hegel's conception, because you're going through all the stages. So an older stage might be very useful historically for a scientist that everybody else had disregarded as part of the major science, what he calls the royal road to science, right? And I think that's very thoughtful. But on the other hand, I think he basically misapprehends, because he wants everything to remain within the confines of the subject, what mathematics and science were fundamentally saying. Like, he has that part where he says, oh, well, the applied mathematics, which he's referring to physics, applied mathematics, the only way for it to get truth, essentially, is for it to refer to experience, right? And that's kind of his point against it. It has to give a semblance of experience just to find its reality. But the fact is, what the answers, the solutions, ultimately were signifying was that his claim that all of becoming, of all of that which is apparent to us and that we synthesize, is caused by us, is not true, right? That, like, the asteroid that we see, you can translate it into being made by our brains. But what science is indicating is, no, there's something additional to that subjectivizing that is out there. and that is what we are measuring. And that is what he wasn't able to capture. And what is a relic, I think, of the Kantian phenomenal distinction.
Sure, but I mean, I think the break there, though, because I think part of what he's actually critiquing, because he's obviously a fan of science. He makes it very clear from the first 3 pages. He's like, it's very Kantian. Actually, it's a philosophy must be a science. We must do it scientifically. We must be rigorous. But that, and I think this actually speaks a lot to our current situation with the proliferation of technology and obviously our wealth of scientific knowledge, that these discoveries, while they may be factual, do not necessarily contain that notion of true. And that, if we are philosophers, if we are metaphysicians speaking to things beyond the physical world, that while these tools can be very helpful and handy, aren't actually advancing our spiritual selves any farther than we were in the first place.
But as he defines spirit is, 1, everything.
Well,
and
sure.
2, it is everything that humans create, right? And so the abstraction of a mathematical formula that goes on to predict black holes, right? Let's say special relativity. It predicts, gravitation, and black holes are part of that, though we do not see them, right? For that, he would dismiss that was just a mere isolated fact, some fact that someone created that's just a empty proposition, right? But then what does that produce? That produces an array of telescopes. It produces a atom collider or a proton collider, and suddenly, hundreds of years later, or 100 years later, we have an array of telescopes around the world, and they take a picture of a black hole, and suddenly the framework of knowledge is transformed. And that is where he does not understand, to me, because what I'm not talking about is his actual propositions on science, because they are problematic in themselves. Sure. The triangle example, that the triangle isn't real because it's broken up into parts that aren't the triangle.
He's not saying the triangle isn't real, but that, he's trying to get at this.
I understand what he's saying. Okay, that was a generalization. But what he's saying is that in the process of doing the or producing this proof of Euclid, right, that you have to break it up into parts, into lines that do not equal what the solution is. And therefore, there is an inequality, a negativity that one has to go through within the process of doing the mathematical formula. Right. Yes, I understand that. But it's a little bit silly.
Oh,
right?
It's a really facetious isn't the right word. It's a very naive argument that he's making. But the point that he's trying to make with his argument is that, to use the black hole example again, it's like, the how the black hole works is only an isolated part of what studying a black hole is. And I think for Hegel, this idea is that, you have to identify, the for itself of a subject. And so what makes, to use the black hole example again, what makes having this vacuum in space, how is that necessary for the spirit of the universe? Why is that important?
Well, this is the division that I'm making. On the one hand, I find it very fascinating to ask, how does that knowledge of that black hole transform subjectivity? Mm-hmm. And that's what he's asking that no one's asked before, or not asked in the same way. Yeah. And in that way, he transforms knowledge. Where he doesn't get far enough is that not everything is caused for the spirit or recognized by the spirit.
Well, he comes in with his big dick energy, and he's kind of blinded to, anything that's not a cheerleader for, his big dick absolute, and so I agree with you there for sure. Because, don't get us wrong. We love, I don't know if we love Hegel, we love philosophy. Yeah.
I love Hegel.
I do too. I didn't want to speak for you, but it's I think this is important when we read these books and we study great thinkers of the past. It's not hard to shoot holes through all of the great theories of the world of history.
Absolutely.
And I think the project for both of us is not about seeing how quickly we can make it Swiss cheese, but finding these moments.
No, I agree absolutely.
Finding these moments that that do change the way thinking is thought.
Yeah.
And still echo back to us, right? Like,
the reason why I pointed that part out is because to me it was this strange moment of collapse. There's a thing about Kant where, despite Kant, I would say, being farther from describing the social whole and the process of knowledge than Hegel is by any means, there's something about the proposition of the dialectic and the absolute that entertains far more logical reasoning about it, right? Okay. And he would deny that at the end, right? Because he functionally says that people are going to come up to this and say that part is wrong or that part is wrong, but that's not really getting the point, right? The point is that to do philosophy is to create a synthetic, self-positing whole that creates its own negativity, and that negativity is the only means by which we can move forward, right? Whether he's right or wrong about any given proposition. So the only reason that I bring that up is because I think it actually extends over the entire whole, which is one single proposition that he makes, but which is implicated in all of it, which is that unlike Kant's system, wherein we're only allowed what we can perceive, and therefore everything else is limited and we can't say anything about it, which I also think is wrong, but is less problematic, right?
Yeah.
What he's saying is we're doing all this, and it's in our minds. Our minds are doing it. And when he's fighting mathematics, and I understand why he's fighting mathematics, because I assume any mathematician at that time was insufferable, right? Like, they were the biggest assholes.
Probably more insufferable than the damn philosophers themselves,
absolutely. But he there's something that we should just keep in mind when we're talking about the dialectic, which is, what is it that subjectivity can do? Like, what because I think it's what's so powerful about him is he brings up that question, and it's why so many people come back to him.
Well, and I can't remember and I'm not going to leaf through this book and bore you all, but I can't remember his exact phrase, but he calls it like the lifeless number. Yeah. Making this assertion where it's like, yes, this is, I'm not arguing that these are facts, but what is it about these figures that is illuminating my life in any way? Yeah. That is, of course, in Hegel's mind, and Hegel's goal is always reaching the absolute, which, to me is kind of a ludicrous goal to start out with, but it's still, I in some ways, maybe a noble goal. I hesitate to say that, but maybe it is. And
sorry to cut you off for a moment, okay. But it's just a simple question. What is the whole, right? And it's a very difficult question to ask, but there is in some sense a whole that we posit all the time, because very basically this is talking about nature. It's talking about how nature becomes its opposite, how it becomes a human culture, right? And
how it becomes its opposite without ever losing itself.
Without ever losing itself, exactly. So that question of what is a whole, while it constantly undermines the process, because you're constantly asking, is there that consistency? But there's a power in claiming universality, which is another word we haven't mentioned.
Oh my God, yeah.
But anyway.
But it is interesting because I think, Hegel is sort of one of these contentious figures in the same way that I'm trying to think of a good liberal example, but like someone like Trump is, or I don't know. I'm failing with the liberal example, but these sort of bombastic personalities who say things, and this is kind of what Hegel does. He says a lot of things where, if you're reading closely, you're like, you're not even going to try and prove to me that that's true, because you're playing the trumpet out of your butt right now. but they're exciting ideas.
Yes.
And
that's what differentiates him from Trump. He's like Castro, or like, you know,
right. Or we can say Lenin.
Yeah. If we say Lenin, we're really creating the continuity, and it's the coolest guy, the coolest, lamest bald guy, you know. But like, he is. I was just reading these quotes of people talking about Lenin and their experiences of Lenin, loving him and then meeting him and being like, man, he's just like this little bald guy.
Shriveled, syphilitic bald guy. My favorite description of him is him like the days before, you know, and obviously the USSR is hanging in the balance, but him dying and it's like mansion, you know, of syphilis, and it's like, all right, Mr. Marxist, dying in your mansion, in charge of a country, cool.
But no, nonetheless, yes. So he's like Lenin, bombastic statements, but he backs it up to some extent, you know.
He does. I mean, and not always, because there's, you know, you pick up Hegel, you're going to read it, especially as you get farther along in this book.
Yes.
You cannot roll your eyes hard enough sometimes, but I mean, but he is searching for, you know, for the things that Kant says that are literally impossible for us to talk about.
Yes.
And it's a courageous approach, if nothing else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just, you know, one thing that I've picked up as a person who's read Deleuze for all my life and have loved him, and what he has taught me is to love the philosophical production of concepts. While many people present him as an anti-Hegelian, while he's criticizing the Hegelian system, he obviously loves Hegel, and you cannot help but immediately recognize the proliferation of concepts, the notion as this totality of a thought, right? His breaking down the proposition into the subject, and then his process of negation by you positing yourself as I, right?
Yeah.
But not I am, not the Cartesian cogito.
Well, and just like judo chops ficta, you know, it's like, no, the I am, there's no am.
Yeah.
You know, the I is the am, right? It's like, which is, I mean, both spiritually awakening, but also conceptually, philosophically, logically awakening. Yes. You know, and that's what's so exciting about Hegel, is that he really is interested in the absolute. He's not, you know, into the religious. I mean, he's not solely into the religious aspect. He's not even solely into the philosophical aspect, you know, and you know, just what he does to logic very quickly. And, you know, he's almost like I don't know, like a Zen master with a cone, where it's just like, yeah, your logic, yeah, you're right, but just destroys it in 2 sentences, you know, where it's like, no, your predicate needs to actually
move and shake, you
right,
know?
right.
It needs to do.
Right, it
needs to be thought through.
And it needs to be for the self
yes.
of the subject you're speaking to. You know, it can't just be decoration. And if it is decoration, you can make all the true statements in the world, but they're all false. They're all wrong.
And in that regard, the other thing that he does interestingly to the subject is when he's talking about the particular subject, we can take it for the human subject, but we can take it also as an animation of the propositional subject, where all of a sudden the concept itself acquires a self-consciousness in a sense, a self-consciousness in its own abstraction. Now, obviously, this is done through human thought, but in the same regard that he sort of does away with matter by making substance the subject, he also gives thought a substance, idea a substance, right? That animates thoughts in a way that Kant never could.
Never could. And I mean, it's like no wonder, right? He's like on the precipice of the Napoleonic Wars. He's on this like point in which human society changes so much to one where we can talk about something like the masses. You know, I mean, he is at the point where that is something you could maybe start talking about, right? And you start seeing this fractaled out, you know, in the works of Benjamin later, writing about, Edgar Allan Poe's detective stories and the crowd and this whole concept, or the flaneur and all this other stuff. But he's recognizing that moment that subjectivity can be a collective thing and not just an individual one. And that's another point where he's really sort of pushing philosophy off a cliff in some ways.
Yeah, and so we can bring in, I think, two last concepts that he brings into this whole process. One is part of negativity, and that is alienation. So we should differentiate it from what some might be familiar with, which is Marxian alienation. It is not the alienation of the subject from their labor by capitalism. Okay? It's actually more complex concept, which is that we are constantly being self-alienated from ourselves by the abstraction of being predicated, right?
Exactly.
Right?
Honey. Oh, yeah. Say that for me again. Wow.
And then the second part of it is that this whole process is a labor, right? So you see where Marx gets it from, but he uses it in very different ways. Thought itself is a labor that it must be struggled through, right? There's no easy route. That any point at which a person just tells you that you can get like an ecstatic vision of nature or a bare fact, right? That they are taking something from you. And I think that's the most powerful aspect of what he's talking about, and there's a reason why it gets picked up again. But, the subject now becomes something different. Its substance becomes something different. And it takes a very astute philosopher to be able to do that in 40 pages.
Hallelujah. Yeah, I mean, and that's Hegel's prologue, really. And so we'll be talking more about this book, I think. So expect those coming down the pipeline. Yeah. But I mean, this is really the kernel of Hegelian thought. I mean, it's fascinating because it's written by Hegel as a younger man. So, we can look at other works and maybe get a more mature schematic of his philosophy. But I think this one is the most exciting because it is full of that enthusiasm. That I can't remember in what context he brings it up, but that the ecstatic. Yes. And it's funny because, right, like, he fundamentally shifts what the subject is, what substance is. And I think we're always caught on this rift because it's still exciting in our day, but it's also something we can never know the full impact of because it is the world we inherited.
Yes. Absolutely.
And that's the power of philosophy, is that it literally changes how we interact with the world, whether or not you've read a page. Which
Absolutely.
is kind of a funny thing for Hegel, right?
No, the fact is this, that if it did not exist before the way that Hegel said it did, it certainly did after.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is indicative of the power and truth of his philosophy. And there is, if we can impart anything about thinking in general, is that our thinking indelibly carries the mark of Kant and Hegel about its division of the subject, right? The possibility that anybody would think that our world is simulated would not be possible if it wasn't for German idealism. And these are the exemplars of that style. And Hegel takes it to new heights.
Yeah, and especially Hegel. Yeah, he is the German idealist. So, well, thank you guys for watching. There's going to be more to come on Hegel. Afterwards, we'll touch on Nietzsche and eventually make our way to Marx and Adorno and Deleuze. So hit that subscribe button. You can hit up our Patreon if you want to support our project. But thanks for watching.
Yeah, and I also want to say we have a lot of new things coming. We have had a busy couple months, and
I got married.
Yeah, we got a guy who's gotten married, and we're gonna try a lot of new things for you guys, and we really appreciate your time. Peace and love.
Thank you, boys.